Phil Cox, Inspector with the Department of Social Protection. Phil, people will know that if you get hit over the head in the street, the Gardaí will come along and do a criminal investigation. If you get stopped on the side of the road and you've got dodgy diesel in your tank, the customs officials will dip the tank and they'll get a result and you'll be prosecuted. I'd imagine a lot of people out there simply don't know what you do for a living or how you go about your investigations. How would you explain it to someone?
Well, what I would say to you, Jonathan, is that no more so than the other enforcement agencies that you've mentioned there, the department does have a cadre of staff that are employed specifically as social welfare inspectors and social welfare investigators. There are about 400 social welfare inspectors whose function is really to review eligibility and also to ensure that people's entitlement is correct and to make sure that social welfare fraud does not occur. Within that, Jonathan, there are 89 inspectors who are assigned to the department's Special Investigation Unit. That unit exclusively investigates social welfare fraud.
So how do you go about it? How do you start your day? I mean, do you wait for a member of the public to ring up and say, I think Johnny Murphy down the road from me is claiming incorrectly, or is it a case that you can attack these investigations from other angles?
No, we use a variety of mechanisms there, Jonathan. As I say, the first thing we would do is that there are ongoing reviews of people's eligibility. The other thing that we would use is we would use validation of entitlement certificates, whereby we're asking people via mail shots. But in terms of the work that we would do is we would also investigate employers. And social welfare inspectors are appointed and have powers whereby they can actually call to employers' premises and conduct employer inspections to see who's on the premises, who is working there, has the employer recorded these people for tax and for PRSI purposes. On the higher end of the scale, Jonathan, then, our investigators in the Special Investigation Unit, that would be a very focused and targeted approach whereby we would be running a number of operational projects over a year on very specific sectors.
Give me an example of that. I mean, do you guys actually actively go out onto the street, or do you watch people using binoculars? Do you try and follow a paper trail? How does it work?
Well, in terms of some of the operations we would run them on sectors. For example, there are a number of where we would consider high-risk sectors. In many circumstances, these are cash businesses where there is a capacity for people to be in what you could term the hidden or black economy. So really what we would do is we'd build up our intelligence. We would also do a lot of joint operations with the revenue commissioners. We do have a joint investigation unit which looks jointly, and inspectors from revenue and inspectors from the Special Investigation Unit would call to sites, would call to construction sites. I mean, in one region alone we would have done over 400 site inspections, whereby we would call. In some cases we'll use intelligence, in some cases we'll use and observe what's going on in those premises, but then we'll enter the premises and make inquiry of anybody who is on that site or premises.
And when you start investigating, what do you find? I mean, who are the people who are perpetrating this fraud?
Well, there's a range of frauds that we do find. I mean, in the first instance, one of the more common ones is we have people who are concurrently working and claiming benefits, usually job seekers benefits, or else claiming illness and disability payments. The other thing that we find when we're conducting our investigations as well is the whole question of people may not have disclosed income or their means to us. In terms of the employer inspection programme, what we do find is we would find people who haven't had PRSI remitted for them, or their wages record aren't kept in a sufficient manner. Some of the other things that we would find is a lot of our investigations would find that people are not resident in the state, and as I say, what we do in those cases is we would terminate the payments. On the very serious end of it, Jonathan, the other thing that we do find is the whole question of identity fraud or somebody else claiming for somebody else.
And that's what people always text in their droves about when we talk about social welfare fraud. It's the idea of people not resident in the country who are claiming child benefit or whatever. And this seems to have gone on with impunity for a long time, and it's only now the department is getting to grips with it. But how do you go about proving that the person who's on the list isn't in the state? Is it you have to literally go and knock on the door to see if they're resident?
That's precisely part of it. The other thing is that we would be closely cooperating with other agencies in terms of determining. I'll give you a classic example of that. I mean, if we had our suspicions that somebody was no longer in the state and claiming child benefit, what we would do is we more than likely would make a home visit, but we would also make inquiry to the schools that these children were alleged to be resident in. So as I say, we use a variety of sources in terms of determining, whether a person is resident in the state. We have run ongoing projects in relation to that whole question of non-residency. And perhaps just to give you an illustration and demonstration of that, I mean, our project this year, we would have done over 2,800 home visits in the case of people where we had intelligence or we had reason to believe that they may not be residing in the state. And from those 2,800, we would have terminated 308 payments to a value of about 3.2 million euros.
That's a lot of money.
It is a lot of money, but again, I think, in fairness, we are vigilant and we have been running ongoing projects in this particular space and with some success. But what I do want to say, Jonathan, I think it's important, is the corollary of that is that 90% of those cases have a legitimate entitlement. And I think I should also reference in that the vast majority of people who are on social welfare have a real need for that entitlement, and what our effort is designed towards is making sure that those who have a legitimate entitlement get it, but those who are perpetrating any fraud we deal with very efficiently.
Phil Cox, you talk about being vigilant, but I have to ask you, 345 million was saved in the first few months of this year, the first 7 months. The Minister is now talking about another 625 million to be saved next year. That's almost €1 billion in fraud that was in the system. All very well that it's happening now, but what have we been doing for the last few years?
Well, in fairness to the Department, I think you have to look at it in the following context, Jonathan. We have witnessed the greatest increase in the live register that the state has ever seen. The Department quite correctly had to focus its energies on claim processing to deal with that, which meant that our capacity in terms of what our inspectors were doing was concentrated towards claim processing. And I think it's very important that the priority had to be. However, that balance has changed, and what we're trying to do now is get that equilibrium between ensuring that people get their rights and entitlement, to balance that with the necessary control activity that we have to do. So, as I say, we really are refocusing, we really are redeploying, but I think that people have to put this in a context in terms of what we've been doing. I think what we've been doing is handling a huge increase and significant increase on demand for social welfare payments, which is unfortunately a tragedy of the economic crisis.
The Minister was talking the other day about getting feet on the street, making sure that people like you go out and actively investigate, knock on doors, check to see who's resident, is there money being claimed by this house that shouldn't get it. Is it a dangerous business for you to knock on the door? Because I'd imagine if you are perpetrating social welfare fraud, yours is the last knock on the door that you'd want.
Certainly. Indeed, I mean, you are dealing in a conflict situation at times, but again, all our inspectors are very professional, and we don't put ourselves in harm's way. I mean, if we are doing operations whereby we're going on sites, if we are doing operations in terms of vehicle checkpoints, we will follow best practice there in terms of health and safety. Yeah, you're going to encounter conflict. That's an immutable fact of life when you're investigating. But as I say, the professionalism of our inspectors to handle that is very, very commendable.
Will the conflict ever turn violent?
We have had occasional instances of whereby our staff would have been threatened and abused. Thankfully, in recent times, we have had no incidents where there has been physical violence.
Looking at the statistics that came out earlier, up to the end of July 2011, 159 cases finalised in court. The majority of them, I think, were job seekers' claims. Only 4 people were sent to jail, which I presume is the ultimate sanction that's open to this type of investigation. Why don't we jail more people who are caught for this? I mean, is it primarily just to stop the fraud rather than prosecute? No,
social welfare fraud is a crime. However, when we select cases for prosecution, we select those cases based on a number of criteria. The duration the fraud has taken place, the amount that would have been fraudulently obtained. So, as I say, we look at this fairly forensically in terms of the cases that we do send to the courts. The other thing I have to say to you, Jonathan, is our job is to through the Chief State Solicitor's Office and indeed the DPP on cases of indictment is to get these cases to court. How the courts handle them is something we can't have any jurisdiction over. As I say, the judiciary will deal with this matter as they see fit, and appropriately so.
When you deal with these people, Phil, when you knock on the door, when you speak to them, do you always get the impression, as I think that there is this idea out there, that people know what they're doing is wrong, but they're willing to chance their arm for as long as they get away with it? It's something built into the Irish psyche.
Well, I think there's a couple of elements there. I think certainly there is a shift in culture, Jonathan. There's no doubt about it from the information we receive from Good Citizen reports, is that attitudes have changed markedly in relation to the whole question of social welfare fraud. In terms of the continuum of fraud that we come across, I think most people are aware of the fact that in case of fraud, they know what's wrong and right. But the other thing to say to you as well is that there are elements of very serious and organised fraud, and as I say, we've forged very good relationships with Garda Síochána, and particularly the Garda Bureau of Fraud Investigation, and we've had significant success in dealing with that very serious and organised type of fraud.
When you talk about that type of fraud, is it a case that there are singular households out there? There was a TD on this programme, Niall Collins, a few weeks ago saying that he had suspicions that there was up to 90 grand going into certain households that were claiming multiple benefits. Have you ever come across a figure as big as 90 grand when you carried out an investigation?
Yeah, indeed we have, and I'll comment on this particular case because it is a matter of public record. In July we had a very serious case of multiple claiming whereby the individual involved had 8 identities. He amassed a amount of €250,000 in social welfare fraud. Now, what I want to say about this particular case, Jonathan, is that it was an incredibly sophisticated fraud in terms of the identities and the levels of this particular individual. The other thing to say that was a joint Garda Special Investigation Unit operation and resulted in the case being brought by the DPP to the Circuit Court, whereby the judge made commentary in relation to the investigation that was undertaken, and also handed down a 12.5-year sentence, which is considerably significant sentence.
Yeah, I'm imagining that is the exception to the rule. There are probably people listening to this now who are perpetrating fraud, maybe on a much smaller level. They're never going to engage in that kind of thing. But with 89 inspectors in the Special Investigation Unit, with a few hundred other inspectors that are working in the department, they might be willing to sit back in their chair to say, look, they're never going to find me. They'll never have the wherewithal to catch me out. What do you say to them?
Well, I would say to them that, I've been a long time an investigator, and normally in circumstances what goes around comes around. At some point in time people will slip up, The other thing to say to you is that we are refocusing our efforts in terms of the level of reviews we do. The other thing to say to you is that we have more sophisticated matching of data from other agencies, which gives us information in relation to people who may be in prison. We have data matching with the prison service. We have data matching with revenue in relation to people who commence employment. So I think the prospect and chances of somebody staying outside the radar are less than they would have been.
Phil Cox, Inspector with the Department of Social Protection. Thanks for talking to us today, Phil.
Thank you, Jonathan.